Hi, I'm Liz from Pennington Quiltworks, and today I will be taking you through making this really cute foundation paper pieced ornament. So let's get started. Included in your kit are printed templates for the two designs to be foundation paper pieced, 6 different fabrics, a 4-inch wooden hoop, and a length of ribbon for hanging your ornament when it's done. I also recommend having a light board, which is optional, a cutting mat, a rotary cutter and straight ruler, as well as add a quarter rulers if you have them, a seam roller, fabric scissors, a glue stick, an iron, and foundation papers, which you can photocopy the patterns onto, can also be very handy. To begin, I have gone ahead and I used the special foundation paper and I photocopied the original templates directly onto a piece of the foundation paper. It's a little bit thinner and has a slightly different texture than the copy paper that we've included in your kit. I've trimmed out just the log cabin because that's the one I'm going to be working on for this video. It helps to go into this project with a plan for how you'd like to use your fabrics and color placement. I've decided that I'm going to alternate white stripes with multicolored stripes radiating out from the center. So I'm going to begin by subcutting my squares of fabric into roughly 1.5 to 1¾ inch strips, just so they're a little more manageable to begin working with. So I will cut myself about 2 of each color, so they're just kind of under 2-inch strips. I'm not really paying too much attention to how straight my line is because we will be trimming as we go. So I just want to pre-cut all of the fabrics down. Now you will have enough fabric in your kit for all kinds of different color combinations, so feel free to play around with it. You don't have to put them in any specific order. You can really just have fun and get creative with your color combinations. When I paper piece, I like to make sure that I am set up so that I have a work surface where I can cut right next to my machine, because there's a lot of back and forth from sewing a little section and then trimming and cutting and measuring. So it's really helpful if you're able to set yourself up so that you aren't having to get up and walk across the room every time you need to cut after sewing. So I like to have my light board with its cutting mat right next to my machine whenever possible. So I have my template printed out and trimmed. You don't have to worry about what kind of edge you have outside of the printed area of your template. The way that the piece will go into the hoop, you have lots of extra space, and so any ends that are hanging off, any kind of raggedy edges, you don't need to have any sort of seam allowance after you've finished your complete design, so you don't have to worry about what kind of margins you have outside of the printed template area. So I've just kind of roughly cut mine out. Again, it's the foundation paper, which is a little bit thinner, but if you were using the copy paper that came in your kit, that's completely fine as well. I have my machine set up with a 1.5 stitch length. You want to have a much shorter stitch length than you would normally be using for regular quilt piecing, because when you go to remove the paper, the short stitch length really makes it a lot easier to get those little pieces of paper out. I also have my 1/4 inch 97 foot on this Bernina. You might have noticed it is the special edition Bernina 480. It's a really beautiful faceplate that they've designed, and we have a few that we were able to special order at Pennington Quiltworks. So that's how my machine is set up, just basic cotton thread in the top and the bobbin. So now that I have my template and my fabric kind of pre-cut, I'm ready to begin. I've decided that I'm going to use white for the center of my log cabin. So taking the white scrap, I'm just going to roughly cut myself a piece that will very generously cover the whole section number 1. And sometimes it can be a little bit hard to see if your fabric scrap is actually covering the whole area that you need it to. So that's why I like using a light board, because it really lets you see through your fabric regardless of what color it is, and you can clearly see that there are the lines for the number 1 section on our template. And yes, this piece of fabric very generously covers the whole area with enough seam allowance. So what we will do is flipping over the template. So now it is face down. And you can turn my light board off so that you can see that we're now looking at the back of the template. You want to have your fabric right side up. So the design that's printed, this little white sign, is facing up, and place it over the square that you can now see through your light board. If you don't have a light board, sometimes holding the whole piece up to a window or against an iPad, if you open a white screen on your iPad, can also be a handy trick. You just want to make sure that your scrap of fabric is completely covering the number 1 first area on our template. At this point, you can either use a pin, or I like to use just a little dab of glue on the fabric or on the paper, and that will just hold it in place. Because now we are going to need to prepare our number 2 section. So for me, you can kind of see through. I know that my number 2 section on my template is the log cabin piece directly above the center number 1 square. And so for my design, I'm going to do that in pink. So I'm going to grab a scrap of pink, and I'm just going to, again, seeing through, because of the light board, I can tell that this scrap will very generously cover the section 2 on my template. For your second piece of fabric, you want to make sure that you're flipping it over so it is now right sides together with your first piece of fabric. You want to be looking at the back wrong side of your second fabric scrap. Now placing it on top of the first piece that we have secured with glue, you want to make sure that your second piece of fabric is very generously covering the line. And it's a little hard to see on camera, but you will see on your own template that there is a line between your number 1 block and your number 2 block, and you want to make sure that your piece of fabric generously covers that line, because that's the seam we will be sewing. So now that we have our first 2 fabrics placed, we're going to take this over to the machine, and holding everything in place, flipping it over, and this line right here between the number 1 and the number 2, that black line right there, is what our first seam is going to be sewn on. So you want to place the template with your fabrics still right underneath, nice and smooth, under the foot of your machine, so that when the needle comes down, it will be sewing directly on that printed line in between the number 1 and the number 2 block. And if you're a little unsure, you can use your hand wheel to lower your needle down just to really double check that placement. And if you give yourself 1 or 2 stitches before the line starts, that's perfectly fine. And then you can sew past the end of the line 1 or 2 stitches. And so using my shortened stitch length, I'm just going to sew straight down that first line, and then I've just gone 1 stitch past, and so I'm going to stop and cut. And as you can see, we've got these perfect tiny little stitches directly on that first line, and you can see I've gone 1 stitch to the left and 1 stitch to the right, so I know when the seams are sewn on either side, they will secure that seam between the number 1 and number 2 fabric. On the back, you can see again that just a perfect row of stitching, and then when we lift that up, we'll have a perfectly flat first seam. Now that we have sewn our first line of stitching, we'll need to trim away the excess fabric that will be in our seam allowance for our continued piece. To do that, simply fold the template back against this line of stitching that you've just sewn, and that will naturally help it just kind of fold and crease right exactly along that line of stitching. And then using your outer quarter ruler, the little lip, and I can show you, there's a little lip that will nest right against the folded paper, and that will give you a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance to the right of that notch, which is now resting against the fold in the paper. And so again, I have a cutting mat on my light board so I can cut right on this surface, and I'll just trim away the excess fabric in that seam. And now we have a perfect 1/4 inch seam after our row of stitching. And you can fold back the fabric piece. And I like to use a seam roller to just press the seam flat. If you have an iron handy, you can absolutely take this to your iron, but I find that a seam roller works surprisingly well. And as you can see, I have a nice pressed seam, and I didn't have to bother with that extra step of ironing until the very end. So I'm going to continue to prepare the piece for the number 3 section of the template now, and for mine that will be red. So I'll take my scrap and then cut myself a generous piece that will cover very easily the number 3 section. And then flipping over the template, I'll turn my light board back on so that I can double check that I am placing my fabric, and this is a solid so you can't tell, but again, right side down, just right over where the line of stitching will be, making sure to cover the line above with plenty of seam allowance and below, so that when it's flipped, you will have the entire number 3 area covered. So taking, again, all of this to the machine, flipping it over, we will be stitching right on that number 3 line to the left of the number 3 section, securing the number 3 fabric to the number 1 fabric. And exactly as we did with our last piece, you just want to make sure that everything is nice and flat under the template. You want to make sure that your needle will be coming down right on that black line on your template, and then starting a stitch before the line begins, just so straight down that line to the left of the number 3 block. And then 1 stitch past. And as you can see, we have our line of stitching, and the fabric piece has been secured and is ready to trim and then flip and flatten the crease. So again, we'll fold back my paper right against that line of stitching. I'll take my outer quarter ruler and just trim away all the excess fabric beyond that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then using my roller, I'll just reinforce and press that seam nice and flat. And this ruler is by Violet Craft, and it's absolutely the best. We carry it in the store. So now we will move on to the number 4 block, and that will be green. So I will cut myself a scrap, and then flip this over. I now know that my number 4 block is on the top. I'll place my fabric right sides down, so right sides together with the pieces we've already sewn, and then carefully holding it. I'll go to the machine and stitch down that black line to the left of the number 4 block. And then folding back the paper and trimming our 1/4 inch seam. And then flattening with the roller. And now we're ready for our last turn in this log cabin. So I'll be using blue, cut my scrap, place my fabric wrong side up, right side down, and then I will continue to sew the seam to the left, so the line to the left of the number 5 block. And so now you can see at this point we have stitched all the way around the number 1 block, so that piece is completely secured with stitching, and we will just continue outward following the number order of the pattern and continuing to just cut and place our fabric for the correct size of each block, trimming after sewing our seam, and then continuing on to the next section. And the nice thing about this design is that really once you've completed your first round, everything is just a repeat. And you just kind of continue with whatever color pattern you've chosen, whatever fabric placement, and you'll just continue to piece outward, and you'll get these perfectly teeny tiny pieced seams, and it's really a great way to accurately piece this teeny tiny log cabin design. So I'll just continue and you can follow along. So now I have completed my third round of my log cabin design. So as you can see, I'm doing a repeat of the colors going out from the center, and I'm going to do one more round. You can see it a little better on the back. I'm going to do one more round with the white, and then my last round will be with my final strip of my colored pieces. And so that, the last part, I will just allow to hang off, and then I will show you how to finish when I've completed all of the sewing. So now I have completed my last round of white, and I will do one more round with all of the colors, just using the leftover scraps to completely cover the remainder of the template, and then we will be done. So as you can see, all of the rounds of our block are complete. If you flip it over, all of the interior lines of the template have been covered with stitching. It's a little hard to see because it's white thread, but you can carefully check that all of your corners have stitching lines that extend past the corner, so you know that those seams are all nice and secure and won't come undone. And I, at this point, like to take my block to the ironing mat, and I'm using my wool ironing mat next to my machine right now, and just give the whole block a nice hot iron. And I'm not using steam, it's just a hot iron just directly on the fabric. And this just really helps to flatten and enforce all of these tiny seams that we just sewed. But the nice thing about keeping the paper under the fabric is that if you had any bias edges or there was any kind of diagonal cuts in the fabrics you were using, every seam is enforced and every fabric is enforced with this paper, so no stretching will happen, so everything will just stay perfectly crisp and clean and flat. So now that our block is finished and ironed once, it's time to take out the papers from the back. And starting from the outside, you can really just kind of peel away the papers. The stitching has kind of made a perforation, and so they really just kind of pull away. I like to always use my other hand to brace the stitching, just so that you're not kind of pulling anything out of alignment, you're not pulling any stitches loose. You need like a little bit of resistance just on the piece itself while you're pulling away these papers. But just kind of continue to work your way around. It can get a little fiddly because some of these pieces are kind of tiny, especially as we get towards the center of this log cabin block. But you can just go slowly and peel everything out. So now that the majority of the paper has been removed, you can see that there's a few little places where the paper really has not wanted to fully come out. And so taking a pair of tweezers can sometimes make it a little easier to get out those stubborn little edges that just really don't want to give up the fight. Also, because this is just going to be an ornament, it's not actually, this piece isn't going into a quilt, you're not going to ever see the back of it if you don't want to. If you have little stubborn edges of paper that just don't want to come out and you are not feeling fiddly, then you can just leave them in. They're not going to hurt anything. So now that everything is removed from the back, I'm going to give the block one more press with a hot iron, just to make sure that everything is nice and flat. So now taking the embroidery hoop, the little 4-inch bamboo hoop that was included in your kit, you'll want to loosen the top screw so that you can take out the inner hoop, and then using the outer hoop and the screw as your guide for the top of the ornament, you can just kind of play around with a layout that you're happy with, where you'd like your design centered in your hoop, and then placing everything on top of that smaller inner hoop. You can just snug it all down. There we go. And you can use the very generous exterior kind of scrap edging to, if you need to pull anything, if you need to straighten any of your seams, if anything's warped a little, now's the time to kind of get everything so that you're happy with how it's falling. And then you can go ahead and tighten the top screw, and we're ready for the finishing step. So to finish up this hoop, I'm going to start by taking my fabric scissors and cutting about an inch border around my hoop. And this fabric is going to get folded over into the back of the hoop, so you don't want any pieces that are going to be too long because they won't kind of tuck around the wood nicely. So just a rough cut is all you need to do. And now you can see why it really didn't matter if all of your edges were raggedy and oddly sized. So now that we have, under an inch, about an inch of fabric cut around the hoop, flipping it over, I'm going to take just a regular Elmer's glue stick. You can use the liquid craft glue, but it takes a long time to dry. So if you have a child in the house, or if you're particularly crafty and just have this glue lying around, it works excellent. So taking your glue stick, and it's great that it's purple because you can really see what I'm doing, you're going to put the glue all the way around the fabric, and then you're going to also want to get the glue as well as you can on the wood inside the hoop, because the more glue the better and the faster this will stick. And of course it dries clear, but it's great that you can see exactly how much glue I'm using because it's now purple. And so then just around the wooden hoop, and then if you can kind of open up your glue stick, you can use the edge to really get on the inside of the hoop. And then once you have a good amount of glue, you just press that rough edge over, applying pressure so that it really sticks. And if you need to add a little bit more glue to a space that didn't have enough, that's fine. And as you can see, because it's basically glue on glue, the fabric is just really sticking very nicely and tucking back inside the hoop. And when you look at the front, it's just perfectly finished. And so now all that we have left is to add your ribbon as the hanger. So what I like to do is tie a knot at the end, creating a loop. And then taking the end of the loop, I'm going to slip it through kind of the top metal part of your hoop and just do a little slip knot around that metal hanger. And there we go. You have a really cute finished ornament ready for hanging.